3100 BC, the Nile Delta. The sun rises over the marshlands, casting bronze light across the water. Reed boats drift silently along the riverbanks. In the distance, two armies face each other across a stretch of trampled earth, one beneath the white crown of Upper Egypt, the other defending the red crown of the north. The air is thick with heat and anticipation. At the center stands a man whose name will echo through 3,000 years of history. His face is painted with ochre and ash. His grip tightens around a ceremonial mace, its stone head worn smooth from use. Behind him, thousands of soldiers wait in silence, spears glinting like reeds in morning light. This is not merely a battle. This is the moment Egypt is born. For centuries, the land of the Nile has been divided. Two kingdoms, two cultures, two visions of power. Today, one king will claim them both. He will take two crowns and forge them into one. He will transform scattered villages and rival cities into something the world has never seen. A unified nation, a single throne, a dynasty that will outlast empires. His name is Narmer, and Egypt will never be the same. To understand how Egypt became a kingdom, we must first understand the river that made it possible. The Nile is not like other rivers. It flows northward through one of the harshest deserts on earth, bringing life to a narrow ribbon of land that would otherwise be barren stone and sand. Every summer, the river swells with floodwaters from distant highlands, spreading dark silt across the fields. This silt is rich with nutrients. It transforms the valley into a garden. For thousands of years, people gathered along its banks, not as wanderers, but as settlers who learned to plant, to harvest, to stay. By 4000 BC, small farming villages dotted the Nile Valley. Families built homes from mud brick. They cultivated emmer wheat and barley. They raised cattle and goats. They buried their dead with care, placing pottery and tools beside the bodies. Offerings for a journey they believed continued beyond death. These were not primitive people. They were innovators, artisans, traders. They wove linen from flax. They shaped clay into vessels of remarkable beauty. They carved ivory and stone into figurines and amulets. But the Nile was long. Over 600 miles separated the lush delta in the north from the rocky cataracts in the south. Distance bred difference. The south, what would become known as Upper Egypt, was a land of narrow valleys and sun-scorched cliffs. Its people were warriors and miners, drawing copper from the eastern desert and gold from Nubia to the south. Their settlements clustered around power centers like Hierakonpolis and Nakata. Chiefs ruled with authority earned through strength and divine favor. They wore tall white crowns shaped like bowling pins, symbols of their dominion over the southern lands. The North, Lower Egypt, was a different world entirely. The Nile split into a vast delta, a maze of waterways and wetlands teeming with fish and waterfowl. The soil was darker, richer. Cities grew larger here. Trade flourished with Mediterranean merchants and Levantine settlers. Northern rulers wore flat red crowns with tall spirals rising from the back. Their culture was cosmopolitan, influenced by contact with foreign lands. For centuries, these two Egypts coexisted. They traded with one another, they shared gods and language, but they did not share power. By 3500 BC, rivalry had sharpened into conflict. Chiefs became kings. Villages became cities. Temples rose from the earth. Structures of mud brick and stone where priests performed rituals to ensure the Nile's flood, the sun's return, the fertility of the land. Religion and politics intertwined. A king was not merely a military leader. He was a living link between the human and divine realms. His authority came from the gods themselves. Warfare became inevitable. Upper and Lower Egypt clashed over trade routes, over fertile lands, over access to resources from abroad. Fortified settlements appeared along the valley. Armies marched beneath standards depicting falcons, bulls, and scorpions. Victory was commemorated on ceremonial palettes, flat stones carved with scenes of triumph. Defeated enemies were shown bound and kneeling. Kings stood tall, maces raised, ready to strike. This was the world into which Narmer was born, a world on the edge of transformation, where the idea of Egypt existed, but the reality did not yet. The path to unification did not begin with Narmer. It began with the kings who came before him, ambitious rulers who dreamed of a unified land but lacked the strength, the strategy, or the divine favor to achieve it. Among them was a figure history remembers only as the Scorpion King. His name is lost to time, but his image survives on a ceremonial mace head discovered at Hierakonpolis. He is shown wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, holding a hoe, digging an irrigation canal. Behind him, workers toil, standards bearing the symbols of conquered nomes, administrative districts, hang in rows. This was not merely a king. This was a conqueror, a unifier, a man who understood that power came not only from war, but from controlling the river itself. The Scorpion King may have been Narmer's predecessor, perhaps his father, perhaps his rival. The evidence is fragmentary, the chronology uncertain. What is clear is that by 3100 BCE, the momentum toward unification had become unstoppable. Upper Egypt had advantages. Its kings controlled access to Nubian gold and desert minerals. They commanded disciplined armies forged in generations of conflict. Their religious centers, especially the temple at Hierakonpolis dedicated to Horus, the falcon god, gave them divine legitimacy. Horus was the god of kingship, the sky deity whose eyes were the sun and moon. To rule in Horus's name was to claim cosmic authority. Lower Egypt, for all its wealth and trade connections, was divided. The delta's geography fragmented power. Multiple cities competed for dominance. No single king could marshal the resources of the entire north. When Upper Egypt finally moved, the north could not unify quickly enough to resist. But unification was not simply a military matter. It was economic, ideological, spiritual. Egypt in 3100 BCE existed in a world undergoing profound transformation. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were building the first cities, Uruk, Eridu, experimenting with writing, law, and centralized administration. In the Levant, fortified towns controlled trade between continents. Humanity was learning to organize itself on scales never before attempted. The age of kings and kingdoms had arrived. Egypt could not remain fragmented and survive. The Nile's bounty created surplus, grain, cattle, linen, but surplus required management. It required storage, distribution, protection. It required a state. Local chiefs could no longer coordinate the large-scale irrigation projects necessary to maximize harvests. They could not maintain trade networks stretching from Nubia to the Mediterranean. They could not defend against external threats from desert nomads or Levantine raiders. Unification was not merely desirable, it was necessary. Narmer understood this. He was a product of his age, a warrior trained in the martial traditions of Upper Egypt, but also a visionary who grasped the power of symbols, of ritual, of propaganda. He knew that conquering Lower Egypt required more than defeating its armies. It required convincing the northern people that his rule was not occupation but destiny. He adopted the iconography of both kingdoms. He claimed protection from Horus and Nekhbet, the vulture goddess of the south, but also from Wajet, the cobra goddess of the north. He portrayed himself as the unifier chosen by the gods, not to destroy the north, but to join it with the south in sacred marriage. His capital would be Memphis, the White Walls, built at the junction where the Nile Valley met the Delta. This was no accident. Memphis was a geographical statement, neither fully southern nor fully northern, but a synthesis. A new Egypt, forged from two ancient ones. The year was 3100 BC. The world stood at the threshold of a new age. And, in the Nile Valley, a king prepared to cross it. Everything that followed, 3,000 years of pharaohs, pyramids, and power, began with what happened next. Angle 1, the human experience for the common people of Egypt. Unification was not an abstraction. It was survival, labor, and the hope of stability in a world defined by uncertainty. In the villages of Upper Egypt, farmers rose before dawn to work fields still damp with Nile silt. They planted barley and emmer wheat using wooden plows pulled by oxen. Their homes were simple, single, room structures of mud brick with reed roofs. Inside, families slept on woven mats, cooked over open fires, and stored grain in clay jars sealed with mud. Life revolved around the river's rhythm, the inundation in summer, the planting in autumn, the harvest in spring. War disrupted this rhythm. When kings called for soldiers, men left their fields. They carried spears tipped with flint or copper, wooden shields covered in animal hide, and maces shaped from hard stone. Some never returned. Their families received no compensation, no recognition. They simply disappeared into the anonymity of ancient battlefields. In the northern delta, life was different but no less precarious. Fishermen navigated papyrus marshes in reed boats, casting nets for tilapia and catfish. Craftsmen in workshops shaped pottery, carved wood, and wove linen so fine it was nearly transparent. Merchants traded with foreign ships arriving from Byblos and Cyprus, exchanging Egyptian grain for cedar wood, olive oil, and wine. But the delta's wealth made it a target. Raids from the south became more frequent. Villages paid tribute to whichever king's army arrived first. Loyalty was a luxury few could afford. For these people, farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, mothers, children, unification meant one thing: the end of constant warfare. A single king meant a single law, a single tax system, a single authority. It meant knowing which god to honor, which temple to support, which ruler's name to invoke for protection. Narmer promised them peace. Whether he could deliver it remained to be seen. Angle 2, the religious foundation. Egypt was never merely a political entity. It was a divine construct, a reflection of cosmic order imposed upon the chaos of the material world. The Egyptians believed the universe began in darkness and water, the primordial chaos called Nun. From this chaos, the first god emerged, Atum, the self-created one, who stood on the primordial mound and spoke creation into existence. He created Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture. They in turn gave birth to Jeb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. From Jeb and Nut came Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, gods who governed life, death, order, and disorder. This mythology was not mere story. It was cosmology, law, and political theory combined. The pharaoh was not simply a king. He was the living Horus, the earthly embodiment of the falcon god who ruled the heavens. When a pharaoh died, he became Osiris, ruler of the underworld, and his son inherited the throne as the new Horus. Kingship was thus eternal, cyclical, divine, but this ideology required acceptance. In the fragmented predynastic period, local gods dominated. Hierakonpolis worshipped Horus, Ombos revered Seth, Nekheb honored the vulture goddess Nekhbit. Buto venerated the cobra Wajet. Each city's deity legitimized its ruler's authority. Narmer could not simply impose his southern gods on the north. Instead, he synthesized them. He wore both crowns, the white Hejet of Upper Egypt and the red Deseret of Lower Egypt, combining them into a single symbol of unified power. He claimed patronage from both Nekhbit and Wajet, depicting them together as the two ladies, protectors of the dual kingdom. Temples became instruments of unification. Priests were appointed by the crown, rituals standardized. The king alone could communicate with the gods on behalf of the people. To rebel against the pharaoh was to rebel against divine order itself, an act of cosmic treason. Religion transformed conquest into inevitability. Narmer did not merely defeat Lower Egypt. He fulfilled divine will. Angle 3. The military machine war in predynastic Egypt was brutal, personal, and decisive. Armies were small by later standards, hundreds or low thousands rather than tens of thousands, but they were effective. Upper Egyptian warriors trained from youth. Boys learned to use the mace, a wooden shaft topped with a pear-shaped stone head capable of crushing skulls through leather helmets. They mastered the spear, the primary weapon of Egyptian infantry, and the bow, though archery was less developed than it would become in later dynasties. Soldiers fought in loose formations, not the disciplined phalanxes of later civilizations. Combat was chaotic, hand-to-hand, determined by individual courage and strength. Victory went to the side with better leadership, superior numbers, or control of key terrain, river crossings, fortified settlements, grain stores. Fortifications were simple but effective. Settlements surrounded themselves with mud, brick walls reinforced with timber. Gates were narrow choke points easily defended. Watchtowers allowed early warning of approaching armies. Narmer's military advantage lay not in superior technology but in superior organization. Upper Egypt's long history of conflict had forged a warrior culture. Kings maintained standing forces of professional soldiers, men who trained year-round rather than seasonally. These veterans formed the core of Narmer's army, supplemented by conscripted farmers during campaign season. Naval power also mattered. Control of the Nile meant control of transportation, communication, and logistics. Narmer's forces used boats to move troops quickly, bypass fortifications, and strike deep into enemy territory. The delta's maze of waterways, which should have favored defenders, became a highway for invasion. But Narmer's greatest weapon was not military, it was psychological. He understood that total victory required not just defeating armies but breaking wills. Captured enemies were ritually humiliated. Chiefs knelt before him in public ceremonies. Their symbols of power, crowns, standards, weapons, were taken and displayed as trophies. This was not merely cruelty. It was statecraft. Resistance became not just futile but shameful. Angle 4. The economic imperative wealth in ancient Egypt meant one thing: grain. The Nile's annual flood deposited nutrient, rich silt that produced harvests unmatched anywhere in the ancient world. A single acre of Egyptian farmland could feed far more people than the same acre in Mesopotamia or the Levant. But this abundance required management. Grain had to be stored against years of low floods. Surpluses had to be distributed to non-farming populations: craftsmen, priests, soldiers, administrators. Trade networks had to be maintained with foreign lands that supplied what Egypt lacked: timber from Lebanon, copper from Sinai, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Fragmentation made this impossible. Each local ruler hoarded resources. Trade was disrupted by warfare. Merchants faced inconsistent tariffs, banditry, arbitrary confiscation. The system was inefficient, wasteful, vulnerable. Unification promised economic rationalization. A single administration could coordinate large-scale irrigation projects, canals, dikes, reservoirs that maximized agricultural output. A central treasury could stockpile grain against famine. A unified military could protect trade routes and suppress banditry. Narmer understood this. His propaganda emphasized not just military victory but prosperity. Images showed him digging canals, opening trade routes, ensuring the Nile's flood. He positioned himself as the guarantor of Egypt's wealth, the king who would make the land flourish. For merchants, craftsmen, and farmers, this was compelling. Stability meant profit. Unity meant security. A strong pharaoh meant full granaries and busy markets. Economic logic thus reinforced military conquest and religious ideology. Unification was not just powerful or sacred, it was profitable. Angle 5. The leader Narmer's rise. Narmer was not born to unite Egypt. He was forged by it. His early life remains shrouded in mystery. No records detail his childhood, his training, or his ascension to the throne of Upper Egypt. What survives are images, powerful, deliberate, propagandistic. They show a man who understood that kingship was performance, that power was as much about perception as force. He may have been the son of the Scorpion King, inheriting a kingdom already expanding northward. Or he may have been a usurper, a military commander who seized power and completed what his predecessors began. The evidence is ambiguous, but what is clear is that Narmer possessed qualities his predecessors lacked: strategic patience, political cunning, and an intuitive grasp of symbolism. He did not rush into war. Before marching north, he consolidated Upper Egypt completely. He eliminated rival power centers. He secured alliances with Nubian chiefdoms to the south, ensuring his supply lines of gold and soldiers. He appointed loyal administrators to manage taxation and grain storage. He commissioned monuments and ceremonial objects that depicted him as chosen by the gods. Not merely a strong king, but the rightful king. When he finally moved against Lower Egypt, it was not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator ordained by divine will. His propaganda emphasized unity, not subjugation. He claimed to be restoring the Egyptian concept of cosmic order, balance, and justice. The fragmented north was portrayed as chaotic, weak, vulnerable. Narmer offered not destruction but salvation. This was brilliant statecraft. It gave northern cities a way to surrender without shame. They were not capitulating to a foreign enemy. They were accepting inevitable divine order. Narmer also understood the power of mercy. After defeating rival kings, he did not execute them all. Some were integrated into his administration, given titles and responsibilities. Their children married into royal families. This created a web of loyalty and obligation that bound former enemies to the new state. But mercy had limits. Those who resisted too fiercely faced annihilation. Their cities were burned, their populations enslaved or displaced, their names erased from records. Narmer's message was clear: join willingly and prosper, or resist and disappear. He was a warrior, a diplomat, a priest, king, and a propagandist. He was Egypt's first pharaoh because he understood what a pharaoh needed to be. Angle 6. The archaeological evidence. The Narmer Palette. History's most important moments often rest on small objects. For Narmer's unification, that object is a ceremonial palette roughly 2 feet tall, carved from dark green siltstone, discovered in 1898 at Hierakonpolis. The Narmer Palette is not merely art. It is a historical document, a propaganda piece, and a religious artifact combined into a single stunning work. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. He stands tall, right arm raised, gripping a mace above the head of a kneeling captive. His left hand grasps the captive's hair. Behind the captive, a falcon, Horus, perches on papyrus plants, symbol of Lower Egypt. The falcon holds a rope attached to the captive's nose, literally leading the north into submission. The message is unmistakable. Horus, through Narmer, conquers the Delta. Below this scene, 2 more defeated enemies lie twisted and broken, their bodies contorted in death. Narmer's sandal bearer stands behind him, carrying the king's sandals, a mark of his divine status, for gods and kings do not walk barefoot among mortals. On the reverse side, Narmer wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. He marches in a ceremonial procession, preceded by standard bearers carrying symbols of conquered territories. Before him lie 10 decapitated bodies, their heads placed between their legs, a gruesome display of total victory. At the center of this side, 2 serpopards, mythical creatures with long, intertwined necks, form a circle. This circle is the palette's actual functional element, where cosmetics were ground for ritual use. But symbolically, it represents the 2 lands of Egypt knotted together, unified by the king's will. Scholars debate the palette's meaning. Some argue it commemorates a specific battle. Others believe it represents a symbolic or ritualized depiction of unification, not a literal event. The truth likely lies between. Narmer probably fought multiple campaigns over years, and the palette condenses this complex history into a single, comprehensible narrative. What is not debatable is its purpose. This was propaganda carved in stone, placed in a temple where priests, nobles, and foreign dignitaries would see it. It proclaimed Narmer's legitimacy, his divine mandate, and his absolute power. It established the visual vocabulary of Egyptian kingship, the smiting pose, the dual crowns, the defeated enemies, that would persist for 3,000 years. The Narmer Palette is the birth certificate of Egypt itself. Angle 7. The northern resistance, the enemy's perspective history, is written by victors, and Narmer wrote his story in stone. But Lower Egypt did not surrender quietly. The northern kingdoms had their own proud traditions. Their cities were ancient, their temples magnificent, their trade networks extensive. They did not see themselves as chaotic or weak. They saw Upper Egypt as a desert kingdom of warriors and miners, powerful, yes, but culturally inferior to the sophisticated, cosmopolitan Delta. When Narmer's armies appeared on the horizon, northern kings rallied their forces. They fortified cities. They flooded fields to slow the enemy's advance. They called on allied nomadic tribes from the Sinai and Levant. They fought with desperation born of knowing that defeat meant not just political subjugation, but cultural erasure. Some cities resisted siege for months. Walls were breached and rebuilt overnight. Every street became a battlefield. Women and children threw stones from rooftops. Priests invoked curses against the invaders. But Upper Egypt's military superiority was overwhelming. One by one, the Delta's fortresses fell. For the northern people, unification was trauma. Their kings were deposed or killed. Their temples were repurposed to honor southern gods. Their languages and customs were gradually suppressed or absorbed. The red crown of Lower Egypt, once a symbol of independent sovereignty, became a mere component of a larger whole, worn by a king from the south. Yet they adapted. Within generations, northern families had intermarried with southern elites. Northern cities had become administrative centers of the unified state. Northern gods had been incorporated into the national pantheon. The trauma of conquest faded into the pride of belonging to something greater, a civilization that would dominate the ancient world. But in those early years, as Narmer's soldiers patrolled Delta streets and southern administrators inventoried northern wealth, the North mourned. They had lost their independence forever. Unification's cost was paid in northern blood, northern pride, and northern memory. The final campaign began in the season of Akhit, when the Nile's waters receded and left behind fields ready for war. Narmer's army assembled at Hierakonpolis, the spiritual heart of Upper Egypt. Thousands of soldiers gathered beneath standards depicting the falcon Horus, the scorpion, the thunderbolt. They came from villages along the entire length of the southern valley, farmers conscripted for the season, professional warriors who had fought for years, Nubian mercenaries hired with gold. The army was the largest Egypt had ever seen. Priests performed rituals before departure. Animals were sacrificed, incense burned. Narmer stood before the temple of Horus, wearing the white crown, his body painted with protective symbols. The high priest anointed him with oils and declared him the living God, the instrument of divine will. Victory was not a possibility, it was destiny. The march north took weeks. The army moved along the Nile, boats laden with supplies following the current downstream. Villages along the route provided grain, beer, and fresh conscripts. Word of the army's size spread faster than the army itself. Some northern settlements sent emissaries offering submission before a single blow was struck. Others reinforced their walls and prepared for siege. Narmer's strategy was methodical. He did not rush toward the delta's major cities. Instead, he secured the valley first, capturing or accepting the surrender of every settlement between Upper and Lower Egypt. He installed governors, confiscated weapons, took hostages from prominent families. By the time he reached the delta, his supply lines were secure and his rear protected. The first major battle occurred at a fortified town whose name has been lost to history. Its walls were thick mud brick, reinforced with timber. Defenders lined the ramparts with spears and bows. They believed their walls impregnable. Narmer did not assault the walls directly. He ordered his men to divert an irrigation canal, flooding the fields around the town. The defenders watched helplessly as their water supply was cut and their crops drowned. Within days, the town's wells began to run dry. Within 2 weeks, civilians were rioting in the streets, demanding surrender. The gates opened. Narmer entered without losing a single soldier. Inside, he staged a ritual of submission. The town's chief was brought before him, stripped of his regalia, and made to kneel. Narmer placed his foot on the man's back, a gesture depicted on countless Egyptian monuments thereafter. The message was clear: resistance was futile, submission was inevitable, and Narmer's power was absolute. But he did not execute the chief. Instead, he reinstated him as governor under royal authority, gave him a new title, and redistributed grain from the royal stores to the starving population. This was the carrot after the stick, mercy following might. Other towns learned the lesson. Surrender became preferable to siege, yet not all of Lower Egypt submitted easily. The delta's major cities, wealthy, populous, and proud, formed a defensive alliance. They elected a war leader, a king whose name appears on no surviving monument, but who commanded the loyalty of the northern armies. Under his leadership, they made their stand. The decisive confrontation came near the apex of the delta, where the Nile began its split into multiple branches. Here, on a flat plain bordered by marshland, the armies of north and south finally met in open battle. Dawn broke over a landscape transformed by war. Narmer's forces arrayed themselves in a great crescent, infantry at the center, archers on the flanks, boats positioned along the river to prevent retreat. The northern army formed a defensive line, their backs to a fortified settlement that served as their last stronghold. For a moment, silence. 10,000 men faced each other across 100 yards of trampled earth. Standards fluttered in the wind. The sun climbed higher, turning the Nile into a ribbon of molten bronze. Then Narmer raised his mace and the silence shattered. Upper Egyptian infantry surged forward, a tide of spears and shields crashing against the northern line. The impact was deafening, wood on wood, stone on bone, men shouting, dying, pushing forward. The northern line held for minutes, then an hour, defenders fighting with the fury of those who know this is their last stand. But Narmer had planned for this. While the infantry engaged the center, his archers moved through the marshes on the flanks, appearing suddenly on the northern army's sides. Arrows fell like rain, men collapsed, clutching shafts protruding from necks and chests. The northern formation began to buckle. Narmer himself led the final charge. Ancient sources would later claim he killed hundreds with his own hands. An exaggeration, certainly, but one that captured a truth. He was not a king who commanded from safety. He was a warrior who fought beside his men, his white crown visible above the chaos, a rallying point for his forces and a terror to his enemies. The northern line broke. Soldiers fled toward the fortified settlement, but Narmer's boats had already landed troops behind them. The retreat became a massacre. Men threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Some received it, many did not. The northern war leader fell in the final moments of battle. Accounts do not record whether Narmer killed him personally or whether he died in the general slaughter. What matters is that with his death, organized resistance collapsed. fortified settlement surrendered that evening, its gates opened to reveal thousands of civilians, women, children, the elderly, crowded inside, terrified of what would come next. Narmer entered the city and ordered his soldiers to stand down. There would be no sacking, no massacre of civilians. This was not conquest, he declared. This was reunion. He gathered the city's surviving leaders and made them an offer. Kneel now, accept his rule, and prosper under a unified Egypt. Resist further, and their city would be erased from memory. They knelt. That night, Narmer performed a ritual that would define Egyptian kingship for millennia. In a ceremony witnessed by priests, generals, and the defeated northern elite, he removed the white crown of Upper Egypt and placed upon his head the red crown of Lower Egypt. The gesture was revolutionary. Previous conquerors had destroyed their enemies' symbols. Narmer wore them. He did not erase Lower Egypt's identity. He absorbed it, claiming to be not just the king of Upper Egypt who had conquered the north, but the king of both lands, the rightful ruler of a unified whole. Then he did something even more extraordinary. He removed the red crown and placed it atop the white crown, creating a new symbol, the double crown, the Pish, Ent, representing the fusion of two lands into one. Egypt was born in that moment, not through destruction, but through synthesis. Victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. True unification required something more permanent than military occupation. It required a capital, a symbol, a place where North and South could meet as equals under a single throne. Narmer chose a site with precision that bordered on genius. At the point where the Nile Valley narrowed into the Delta, where the southern cliffs gave way to northern marshlands, he ordered the construction of a new city. It would be called in Eb, hedge, white walls, though history would know it by its Greek name, Memphis. The location was strategic perfection. Memphis sat at the junction of the two lands, belonging fully to neither. A king ruling from Memphis could control river traffic moving in both directions. He could respond quickly to threats from either region. He could project power north into the delta or south into the valley with equal ease. But the symbolism mattered even more than the strategy. Memphis represented unity embodied in stone and mud brick. It was a city built from nothing, owing loyalty to no ancient dynasty, belonging equally to all Egyptians. Its very existence declared that Egypt was no longer two kingdoms forced together, but one nation with one heart. Construction began immediately after the final northern cities submitted. Thousands of workers, conscripted laborers, skilled craftsmen, willing settlers seeking opportunity, converged on the site. They dug foundations into virgin soil. They molded millions of mud bricks and left them to bake in the relentless sun. They quarried limestone from nearby hills and floated it down, river on barges. The city rose quickly. First came the walls, massive fortifications of white, washed mud brick that gleamed in the sunlight and gave the city its name. These walls were not merely defensive. They were declarations of permanence, visible for miles in every direction, proclaiming that Memphis would stand forever. Within the walls, workers constructed a royal palace. It was not the grandest structure Egypt would ever build. That honor would belong to later pharaohs and their pyramids, but it was magnificent by the standards of its age. Halls with cedar columns imported from Lebanon, floors of polished stone, walls painted with scenes of Narmer's victories, his divine coronation, his offering to the gods. Next came temples. The most important was dedicated to Ptah, the creator god, patron of craftsmen and builders. Ptah was neither a god of Upper Egypt nor Lower Egypt specifically. He was a universal deity, a choice that reinforced Memphis's role as a place of synthesis. Priests from both regions served in his temple, performing rituals that blended northern and southern traditions. Administrative buildings followed, granaries to store the nation's surplus, treasuries to hold gold, copper, and precious stones. archives where scribes would record tax collections, legal judgments, and royal decrees. Egypt was becoming more than a kingdom. It was becoming a bureaucracy, an organized state capable of managing resources across hundreds of miles. Narmer himself oversaw the construction, appearing regularly at the site to inspect progress and perform ceremonial acts, laying foundation stones, consecrating temples, receiving tribute from delegations traveling from every corner of the newly unified land. These delegations revealed the complexity of unification. Chiefs from the southern valley brought gold and animal hides, affirming their loyalty. Northern merchants presented fine linen and exotic goods from Mediterranean trade. Nubian emissaries arrived with ivory and ebony, seeking to maintain the alliance that had supported Narmer's campaign. Even Levantine traders came, eager to establish relationships with a kingdom that now controlled the Nile's entire length. Each delegation witnessed the same carefully staged ritual. They approached the palace through vast courtyards where soldiers stood at attention. They entered halls where nobles from both Upper and Lower Egypt sat together, wearing mixed styles of dress and jewelry. They prostrated themselves before a throne where Narmer sat wearing the double crown, flanked by the protective goddesses of both regions, Nekbit the vulture and Wajet the cobra. The message was unmistakable. Egypt was united, powerful, eternal. Resistance was impossible. Cooperation was profitable. But Narmer understood that symbols alone could not hold a kingdom together. He implemented administrative reforms that would shape Egypt for centuries. He divided the land into administrative districts called nomes, each governed by a nomarch, an official appointed by and responsible to the pharaoh. Some nomarchs were former kings or chiefs, allowed to retain local power in exchange for loyalty. Others were Narmer's own supporters, rewarded with land and authority. He standardized taxation. Every farmer owed a portion of his harvest to the crown. Every craftsman contributed goods. Every able-bodied man owed labor service, digging canals, maintaining temples, constructing royal monuments. This was not oppression. It was the price of civilization, the foundation upon which everything else rested. He created a judicial system. Laws were proclaimed in the pharaoh's name and enforced by appointed judges. Disputes over land, inheritance, or trade were resolved through formal procedures rather than blood feuds. This was revolutionary, the replacement of endless cycles of revenge with predictable, centralized justice. He also began the tradition of royal tombs at Abydos, the sacred site associated with Osiris. Even as Memphis became the administrative capital, Abydos remained the spiritual heart where pharaohs would be buried. This, too, was strategic. It honored Upper Egypt's religious traditions while governing from a neutral location. Within months of the decisive battle, the transformation was visible. Trade flourished as merchants no longer feared banditry or arbitrary confiscation at regional borders. Irrigation projects expanded, coordinated across former boundaries. Temples received steady supplies of offerings. The Nile's flood was recorded systematically, allowing better prediction and preparation. Egypt was working as it never had before, not as a collection of competing regions, but as a single organism with Memphis as its brain, the pharaoh as its will, and the Nile as its lifeblood. Yet unification remained fragile. Northern resentment simmered beneath surface compliance. Southern nobles worried about losing influence to northern merchants. Local gods competed for royal patronage. The bureaucracy was new and improvised, prone to corruption and incompetence. Narmer's achievement was not creating a perfect state. It was creating a functional one, a kingdom that, despite its flaws and tensions, could survive its founder's death and evolve into something greater than any individual ruler. On a spring morning in 3100 BC, Narmer stood on the white walls of his new capital and looked out across the land he had unified. To the south, the valley stretched toward Nubia. To the north, the delta fanned out toward the Mediterranean. Behind him, the sun rose over a palace where officials from both regions labored together. Before him, boats crowded the river, carrying goods and people under a single banner. For the first time in history, all of Egypt belonged to one throne. The age of the pharaohs had begun. Unification did not end with Narmer's coronation in the double crown. It began there. The first years of unified Egypt were a time of consolidation, of transforming military conquest into political reality. Narmer could not simply declare Egypt united and expect centuries of division to vanish. He had to build institutions, establish precedents, and create a culture of unity where none had existed before. The bureaucracy became his primary tool. In every nome, scribes appear, educated men trained in the newly systematized hieroglyphic writing. They recorded everything: grain harvests, tax collections, labor obligations, legal disputes, temple offerings. These records flowed upward to Memphis, where administrators compiled them into comprehensive reports. For the first time, the pharaoh could know with precision what was happening throughout his realm. This knowledge was power. When a northern nome underreported its harvest, Memphis knew. When a southern nomarch diverted taxes to his own treasury, Memphis knew. The scribes were Narmer's eyes and ears, ensuring that local officials remained loyal and efficient. Those who served well received rewards, additional land, prestigious titles, marriages into influential families. Those who failed or rebelled faced swift removal, exile, or execution. But Narmer understood that fear alone could not sustain a kingdom. He also cultivated legitimacy through ritual and religion. Every year, he performed ceremonies that reinforced his divine status. The most important was the Hebsed, a festival of renewal where the pharaoh demonstrated his continued physical vigor and divine favor by running a ritual course, shooting arrows, and performing sacred dances. These public displays reassured the people that their king remained strong, blessed by the gods, capable of maintaining Maat. He also embarked on an ambitious building program. Throughout Egypt, old temples were renovated and new ones constructed. Each bore inscriptions proclaiming Narmer's role as patron and protector. Local priests, dependent on royal support for their temple's maintenance, became agents of royal ideology. They taught congregations that Narmer was not merely a powerful king, but a divine necessity. Without the pharaoh, chaos would return, the Nile would fail, and Egypt would collapse into the disorder that had plagued it before unification. This was not entirely propaganda. The coordinated irrigation systems Narmer's government implemented did increase agricultural productivity. Centralized grain storage did provide insurance against famine. Protected trade routes did bring prosperity. The ideology of divine kingship rested on tangible benefits that ordinary Egyptians could see and experience. Yet resistance persisted, especially in the north. Several times in the early years, northern cities attempted rebellion. Archaeological evidence suggests violent suppressions, burned settlements, mass graves, inscriptions celebrating the defeat of rebels and enemies of Maat. These rebellions never threatened Narmer's overall control, but they revealed the underlying tension. The North had not forgotten its independence. It had merely accepted its loss. Narmer responded with a combination of force and integration. After crushing each rebellion, he pursued a policy of deliberate cultural fusion. He arranged marriages between prominent southern and northern families. He appointed northerners to high positions in Memphis. He commissioned artworks depicting himself in both southern and northern styles. He celebrated both regions' festivals and honored both regions' gods. Gradually, a new identity emerged, not purely southern or northern, but Egyptian. Children born after unification knew no other reality. They grew up seeing the double crown as natural, Memphis as eternal, the pharaoh as divinely ordained. The trauma of conquest faded into the pride of belonging to a great civilization. Trade expanded dramatically. With the entire Nile under unified control, merchants could transport goods from Nubia to the Mediterranean without crossing hostile borders or paying multiple tariffs. Egyptian grain became the Mediterranean world's most reliable commodity. In exchange, Egypt imported cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, and silver from Anatolia. This trade brought wealth that manifested in increasingly elaborate material culture. Jewelry became more intricate, pottery more refined, architecture more ambitious. The elite consumed luxuries that had been rare or impossible in the fragmented predynastic period. This prosperity trickled down, farmers ate better, craftsmen earned more, families accumulated possessions that signaled their rising status. But prosperity also created new problems. Wealth inequality widened. The gap between the royal court and common farmers became a chasm. Memphis grew into a city of stunning contrast. Palaces with walls of imported stone standing blocks away from overcrowded workers' quarters. Nobles dined on imported wine and roasted game, while laborers survived on bread and onions. Narmer's government attempted to manage these tensions through redistribution and public works. During flood season, when farmers could not work their fields, they were conscripted for royal building projects. They dug canals, constructed temples, and expanded Memphis. They were paid in rations, bread, beer, onions, oil, ensuring they could feed their families while contributing to projects that symbolically belonged to all Egyptians. This system of corvée labor would define Egypt for millennia. It was simultaneously exploitation and social contract. Workers resented the hard labor and time away from their families, yet they also took pride in the monuments they built. These structures were not merely royal vanity projects. They were communal achievements, physical proof that Egypt could accomplish what no other civilization had attempted. Narmer also established the principle of royal succession that would govern Egypt for 3,000 years. His heir, possibly his son, possibly a brother or nephew, the records are unclear, was designated while Narmer still lived. This heir was groomed for kingship, educated in administration, introduced to court rituals, and presented to nobles and foreign delegations as the future pharaoh. When Narmer died, the exact date unknown, the circumstances unrecorded, the transition was smooth. There was no civil war, no contest for the throne, no fracturing of the kingdom. The new pharaoh simply stepped into his role as naturally as the sun rose. He wore the double crown, performed the necessary rituals, and continued his predecessor's policies. This continuity was Narmer's greatest achievement. He had created not just a kingdom, but a system, a set of institutions, ideologies, and practices that could survive any individual ruler. Egypt was no longer dependent on one man's strength or vision. It had become something larger, more durable, more inevitable. The unified kingdom he founded would last, with remarkable stability, for nearly 3 centuries before the tumult of the First Intermediate Period. And even after that collapse, Egypt would reunify, rebuild, and endure, always looking back to Narmer's age as the golden origin, the moment when chaos became order and Egypt became eternal. The legacy Narmer created extended far beyond his lifetime, shaping not only ancient Egypt, but the very concept of civilization itself. Within generations of his death, Narmer had been transformed from historical figure into mythical founder. Later Egyptian king lists recorded him as Menes, a name that may have been a throne name, a dynastic title, or a later conflation of several early rulers. The exact relationship between Narmer and Menes remains debated by scholars, but what matters is how Egyptians themselves remembered him as the first pharaoh, the unifier, the king who created Egypt from nothing. This mythologization served a purpose. Every subsequent pharaoh claimed to be Narmer's heir, inheriting not just his throne, but his divine mandate. When Egypt fragmented during intermediate periods, reunification was always framed as restoration. Return to the original unity Narmer had established. The double crown became the ultimate symbol of legitimate rule, to where it was to claim direct continuity with the first king. The administrative structures Narmer established became the skeleton upon which Egyptian civilization built itself. The nome system persisted for 3 millennia, surviving multiple dynasties, foreign invasions, and political upheavals. The scribal bureaucracy he created evolved into one of history's most sophisticated civil services, keeping records with such precision that modern scholars can reconstruct ancient Egypt's economy, population, and social structure in extraordinary detail. Memphis itself became one of the ancient world's great cities. For centuries, it remained Egypt's administrative capital and largest urban center. Even after political power shifted to Thebes during the Middle and New Kingdoms, Memphis retained enormous economic and symbolic importance. Temples to Ptah dominated its skyline. Royal palaces sprawled across its districts. Workshops produced goods that reached from Nubia to Greece. Archaeological excavations at Memphis have revealed the city's magnificence. Massive statues of Ramesses II still lie where they fell centuries ago. Temple foundations stretch across acres. Workshops, warehouses, and residential quarters paint a picture of a bustling metropolis where tens of thousands lived, worked, and worshipped. Though much of ancient Memphis lies buried beneath modern suburbs and agricultural fields, what has been uncovered confirms the textual sources. This was a city worthy of empire. Abydos, meanwhile, became Egypt's most sacred site. Narmer's tomb and those of his immediate successors were built there, establishing it as the eternal resting place of kings. Later, pharaohs constructed cenotaphs, symbolic tombs, at Abydos even when buried elsewhere, maintaining connection with the site where Egyptian kingship began. Pilgrims traveled to Abydos for millennia, leaving offerings and inscriptions that attest to the site's enduring spiritual significance. The Narmer Palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis in 1898 by British archaeologist James Quibble, remains the single most important artifact for understanding unification. Its discovery revolutionized Egyptology. Before the Palette's excavation, scholars debated whether unification was historical or mythical, whether it occurred suddenly or gradually, whether the early dynasties even existed as unified states. The Palette settled many debates. Its artistic sophistication, its clear iconography, and its archaeological context all confirmed that by 3100 BC, Egypt was indeed unified under a single ruler who commanded resources sufficient to commission extraordinary works of art. The Palette's symbolism, Narmer wearing both crowns, defeating northern enemies, performing rituals, provided a visual narrative that aligned with textual sources and archaeological evidence from other sites. Other discoveries have enriched our understanding. Tombs at Abydos yielded seals, pottery, and inscriptions bearing Narmer's name. These tombs also contained evidence of human sacrifice, retainers buried alive or killed to accompany the king into the afterlife. This practice, common in early Egyptian history, was gradually abandoned in later dynasties, replaced by symbolic servants in the form of shabtis, small statues meant to work for the deceased in the afterlife. The practice of human sacrifice reveals the darker aspects of early Egyptian civilization. Unification brought order, prosperity, and cultural achievement, but it also concentrated power to an unprecedented degree. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader, but a god who could demand anything, including lives. This absolute power enabled Egypt's monumental achievements: the pyramids, temples, and vast irrigation systems required mobilizing massive labor forces, but it came at tremendous human cost. Yet, Egyptians themselves did not seem to view their system as oppressive. Texts from all periods express pride in Egyptian identity, devotion to the pharaoh, and satisfaction with Maat, the cosmic order their civilization embodied. Whether this represents genuine belief or successful propaganda is impossible to determine from 3,000 years' distance. Likely, it was both. People genuinely believed in their system, while that system also worked tirelessly to ensure they continued believing. Narmer's unification also established Egypt's relationship with its neighbors. To the south, Nubia became a source of gold, ivory, and soldiers, sometimes allied, sometimes conquered, always economically integrated with Egypt. To the northeast, the Sinai provided copper and turquoise, defended by Egyptian built fortresses. To the north, the Mediterranean became a highway for trade with the Levant, Anatolia, and eventually Greece and Rome. Egypt's unified strength allowed it to dominate its region for millennia, while Mesopotamia saw empires rise and fall. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Egypt endured with remarkable continuity. Its geography helped. Deserts on both sides, cataracts to the south. Sea to the north created natural barriers that protected Egypt, while the Nile connected it internally. But geography alone cannot explain 3,000 years of civilization. That required the institutional foundations Narmer laid. Modern Egypt still reflects Narmer's legacy, the Egyptian national identity, the sense of being a distinct people with ancient root, traces directly to unification. Egyptians today claim heritage from the pharaohs, viewing ancient monuments not as alien artifacts, but as ancestral achievements. The pyramids, temples, and tombs are national symbols, sources of pride and identity. Scholars continue to debate aspects of Narmer's story. Was unification a single event or a gradual process spanning generations? Did Narmer and Menes refer to the same person, or were they separate rulers later conflated? How much of the archaeological evidence represents literal history versus symbolic or propagandistic representation? These debates will likely never be fully resolved. The evidence is fragmentary, the time period impossibly distant, the distinction between myth and history often unclear. But what is indisputable is that around 3100 BCE, Egypt transformed from a collection of competing regions into a unified kingdom that would become one of history's greatest civilizations. And at the center of that transformation stood one man, warrior, priest, king, state, builder, propagandist, and visionary, who saw the possibility of Egypt and made it real. His name was Narmer, and his legacy endures in stone, in text, in the very shape of Egyptian civilization. 3,000 years after his death and 5,000 years after his birth. Stand on the banks of the Nile today, and you stand where Narmer stood 5,000 years ago. The river still rises and falls with the seasons, though dams now control what the gods once commanded. The desert still presses close on both sides, golden and eternal. And somewhere beneath the mud and modern cities, beneath the layers of history and forgetting, lie the stones Narmer placed, the foundations of a kingdom that became a civilization, that became a legend, that became immortal. What Narmer achieved transcends military conquest. Other kings have unified divided lands. Other warriors have worn two crowns, but Narmer created something more enduring than territory or power. He created an idea that diverse peoples could become one nation, that chaos could be transformed into order, that human beings working together under shared purpose could build something greater than themselves. The pyramids would come later, constructed by pharaohs who inherited Narmer's throne. The great temples, the golden treasures, the vast empires stretching from Nubia to Syria. All of these emerged from the foundation he laid. Without unification, there would have been no Old Kingdom, no Middle Kingdom, no New Kingdom. There would have been no Tutankhamun, no Rameses, no Cleopatra. Egypt would have remained what it was before Narmer, a collection of villages and towns, prosperous perhaps, but ultimately forgettable. Instead, Egypt became eternal. Narmer understood something profound about power and legitimacy. He knew that force could conquer, but only symbols could unite. The double crown, the city of Memphis, the fusion of gods and rituals, these were not mere propaganda. They were acts of creation, making real through representation what did not yet exist in reality. He imagined Egypt whole, and in imagining it, made it so. His story reminds us that civilization is not natural or inevitable. It is chosen, built, defended, renewed with each generation. The institutions we inherit, governments, laws, shared identities, began as someone's vision, someone's ambition, someone's refusal to accept the world as it was. 5,000 years from now, will our own civilizations endure as Egypt has? Will future peoples look back at what we built with the same wonder we feel gazing at the pyramids? Or will we be forgotten, as so many Bronze Age kingdoms have been forgotten, leaving nothing but broken pottery and crumbling walls? The answer depends on what foundations we lay, what institutions we build, what symbols we create to bind ourselves together. Narmer's gift to history was not just Egypt. It was the lesson that unity is possible, that order can emerge from chaos, that human beings need not be prisoners of division and conflict. The Nile still flows. The sun still rises over the valley, and somewhere in the eternal Egyptian sand, Narmer rests. The first pharaoh, the unifier, the man who looked at a divided world and dared to imagine it whole. His kingdom fell 3,000 years ago. His name lives forever,